Welcome to the Far and Beyond podcast, hosted by the Contracts and Fiscal Law Department at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. This podcast is for the federal government attorneys navigating the complex intersection of acquisitions and fiscal law and policy. I am your host, Major Ellie Sewell.
And I'm Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Firing.
And I'm Major Ed Callahan. Together we are your co-hosts. And as you may have noticed, we have the chair of ADK here joining us, Lieutenant Colonel Firing. Joined us a few weeks back to talk about some issues that we were facing during the government shutdown. We wanted to ask you back to talk to us a little bit more about this now historical 43-day government shutdown. So I wanted to start a little bit with the basics in the fact that I remember there being a lot of talk and a lot of confusion about the potential as to whether furloughed civilian employees were actually going to get paid. Do you have any insight onto that topic, sir?
All right, first and foremost, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me back. I didn't screw up too badly last time. So, but yeah, I there was definitely an issue ongoing with the government shutdown and whether or not furloughed employees were or were not going to get paid. But to get at the core of the issue, we have to understand why it's so confusing and just go over some of the fundamental concepts of federal fiscal law.
It's time for the rules and the regulations.
Yeah, I'll just two things I want to go over real quick, okay? First, we need to know what is a government shutdown. What does it really mean when the government has a lapse in of appropriations, right? It means that agencies lose the budget authority of appropriations. They lose the budget authority to make obligations which were contingent on appropriations. So any agency actions that are contingent on appropriations need to cease would be the standard, right? So that's the first thing.
Right. So at that point, effectively, the bank accounts are empty. Government has shut the taps off. There's no incoming money.
Generally speaking, you're correct, Ed, right? That is what a lapse in appropriations or government shutdown would equate to. And then the second concept is what we're all intimately familiar with, right? The Anti-Deficiency Act, the ADA. This is the rule book that essentially prohibits any official from obligating or expending money in advance of or in excess of an appropriation or formal subdivision of funds. So those are the two legal concepts that we really want to focus in on.
Okay, so when the funding lapses, you have expired authority, and the ADA says, stop spending now.
Yes, precisely, right? And we have expired budget authority, and we are prohibited from making obligations that are contingent on appropriations. So point of contention for this particular podcast is salaries, whether it be furloughed employees or non-furloughed employees. We're speaking of those employees in which their salaries are contingent on appropriations. And most of our Title V employees, their salaries are contingent on those appropriations. So paying those salaries are going to be affected during a government shutdown, of course.
Right. So if there's no money in the bank account, no appropriations, then there's just nothing to pay them with. No bank account to draw from.
Correct. So let's talk about the application of the government shutdown and what it means for our government civilian employees. So generally we could put them in two different areas, right? You have your employees that are furloughed employees. They're going to be generally considered non-accepted employees. And then you have the non-furloughed employees, which continue to come into the office during a lapse in appropriations, and those are considered the accepted employees. So those are sort of the two categories to think of, your furloughed employees or your non-furloughed employees. One thing note is regardless of whether or not they're furloughed or non-furloughed, meaning regardless of if they're coming into work or not, nobody's getting paid, right? No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but for in consequence of an appropriation, right? So there's no appropriation, there's no money to pull out of the Treasury, nobody's getting paid regardless of obligations or not during a government shutdown.
Right. And as you came in and talked to us about before, the only reason that us military members were able to get paid is because they moved funding from one existing account or one existing appropriation into one that was empty. They didn't get new money. They had moved money that was already out there and appropriated.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, Ed. Exactly.
Okay, so the real anxiety, though, isn't about the during. It's actually the after.
Yeah, and that's the key question here, and that's what's pertinent for today's podcast, right? Right, we talked about furloughed and non-furloughed employees. What is that really speaking of? That's speaking of obligations. The actual payment or disbursement of funds to employees. That's what we're talking about with respect to this podcast. and who gets paid after the government shutdown ends, right? So when can we pay that money? And this is where the law is a little bit different, right? And this is where the law actually changed recently, so it gets a bit interesting.
How recently are we talking? When did this law change?
So prior to 2018, furloughed employees, they were generally not paid, right? So government shutdown hits, civilian employees are furloughed. Even when they come back, they're not going to get paid for the time frame in which they were furloughed during that time frame. And that was sort of the standard. Now, generally speaking, Congress was generous. And what they would do is they would afford those civilian employees back pay for that period of time in which they were furloughed due to the lapse in appropriations. That was generally the standard in practice. No requirement in law, just more of a, hey, sorry for the inconvenience, we'll give you the back pay.
So it was a courtesy, not a legal requirement.
Correct. And then on 16 January 2019, things changed a bit, right? So this was during that 35-day government shutdown. They amended the Anti-Deficiency Act, right? So 31 U.S.C. 1341 was amended. Specifically, subsection Charlie was added. And the change essentially said that all federal employees, whether they were furloughed or working as accepted employees, would receive the standard rate of pay for that period of time, so including those that were furloughed, right? So during that period of time and a lapse in appropriations.
All right, well, that seems like it solves the problem, right? We just guaranteed them the back pay. How come we were talking about it again this time?
Okay, well, story doesn't stop there, right? The Anti-Deficiency Act was amended, but then it was amended again a few days later, and the government added a little bit of qualifying language.
Oh, yeah, attorneys love that.
So they quickly added a subsection C to 31 U.S.C. 1341, and they amended it to say that the previously promised pay was subject to the enactment of appropriation acts ending the lapse.
So effectively, after adding a guarantee, they then, you said just a couple days later, so effectively immediately took that guarantee away?
Yeah, I mean, kind of, right? Because what they potentially created was almost like an entitlement of pay, and they wanted to make sure, hey, this payment is subject to what the Appropriations Acts will say. So federal employees impacted by a government shutdown will only receive back pay if the subsequent Appropriations Act that ends the shutdown specifically provides the funding for it. The guarantee is only as good as the next bill that Congress passes.
So this raises another good question. Does that new Appropriations Act need to specifically state we are funding back pay, or is it just assumed?
All right, so I'm going to nerd out here, so hang out for a moment. So I wrote, when the legislation was passed back in 2019, I wrote an article on this. I had the same question during the article, and I didn't know how it would actually apply in practice and how they would reconcile sort of this new contingent language subject to the enactment of the Appropriations Act. So the most recent government shutdown was the first real test of this new legislation, and we got some clarity on it.
What happened?
So in the new continuing resolution that was passed that ended this most recent government shutdown, Congress didn't just assume it was covered. They were specific. In Section 117, Congress explicitly cited subsection C of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So subsection C of the 1341, you can look it up. And it stated that appropriations shall be made available for both furloughed and non-furloughed employees.
So it seems like there is an initial precedent now. So Congress needs to actively check the box and provide the funds specifically for that purpose.
This was the first real test of that new legislation on how it would act in practice. And that was the takeaway that I got from it. They also included within that same paragraph or section some notwithstanding language, which suggests that it wasn't automatically assumed within the legislation. Congress needs to actually explicitly cite subsection C.
Okay, so if I am a civilian employee and I'm facing a furloughed shutdown, so I'm staying home, I'm not coming into work, I cannot expect back pay?
Well, Ed, like any good attorney says, it depends. All right, it depends entirely on whether Congress puts that specific language and appropriation into the bill that ends the funding lapse. If they don't, it appears there may be some executive branch discretion here, but it's certainly not guaranteed, at least based on the most recent precedent that we've received thus far.
The eternal, it depends. Lieutenant Colonel Firing, thank you for walking us through this complicated but fascinating issue.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Happy to discuss this topic.
Thank you for joining us today on this episode of Far and Beyond. Please make sure to follow us and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
We love to hear from our listeners, particularly when it's positive news, and then we share it with the chair of ADK, Lieutenant Colonel Firing, so that it helps our rating scheme. Please continue to reach out to us on Facebook and LinkedIn. The information can be found in the show notes from today's episode.
The views expressed today are those of the presenters, not that of the Judge Advocate General Corps, the Department of the Army, Department of the Air Force, or the Department of War.